Hello, North Baltimore Mennonite Church. I'm so glad to be joining you in your Lenten sojourn this year, and I'm grateful to Joanne and Ashley for helping this series come to fruition. I especially look forward to joining you live next week. One of the caveats I often make when I step into a pulpit is that I'm more of a teacher than a preacher. That's my way of saying that what you'll be hearing from me is less explication of a biblical text and more exploration of ideas that I think help us make sense of what it means when we say we're Christians. Even so, I believe and trust that I have some good news to share, and my prayer is that we will sense the mystery of the Holy Spirit's movement in the time we share together. There would be different ways to tell the story of how I came to be joining you this season. The one I'm going to tell has to do with what eventually became part of my doctoral work and my teaching, and I would even say my sense of vocation. Last year, I read an article in Anabaptist World magazine about Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship's move to create a Nurture Council. This Nurture Council was based on the 5 life standards developed by Doris Jansen Longacre and published in a book titled Living More with Less. I reached out to Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship and offered myself as a resource to them because back in 2009, I found myself agreeing to do some research into the More with Less cookbook for a paper I agreed to write for a conference being held in Akron, Pennsylvania to observe the 90th anniversary of Mennonite Central Committee. This little research project changed my life. Now, it didn't change my life in a Paul on the road to Damascus sort of way. My life changed in a coming alive way. In grabbing a yellowing copy of Living More with Less from my parents' bookshelf, I found a text that voiced the things I believed, but it wasn't a theology textbook. I realized I had to use my voice to build a bridge from this book that made so much sense to my work as an academic theologian. My life changed because in a collection of cookbooks and a practical guide, I found something of the beating heart of my own faith. As I've shared what I found in this process of putting shared experience into words that's collected not only in Living More with Less and the More with Less cookbook, but also in Extending the Table and more recently Simply in Season. I've been sharing this synthesis with students in my classes, in other conference settings, and Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship's annual gathering this past October. And when I share my organic theology, inspired by Doris Jansen Longacre, others say, yes, Melinda, what you're saying makes so much sense to us. So I'm here because I'm on a mission to share more with less theology with Mennonite communities, where the vision for simple, ethical, faithful, radical living isn't new, but it does need some renewal. Not because we've gotten lazy or are a bunch of backsliders, but because we're our own worst critics. I'm here because I work in the tradition of prophet poets. One of the prophet poets, Doris Jansen Longacre, teaches us that the more with less pathway isn't about perfection. It's about the freedom that comes from authenticity and wholeheartedness and telling the truth about the lies domination culture feeds us on a daily basis. And speaking of these lies, another prophet poet I'm fond of, Gwendolyn Brooks, simply says, truth tellers are not always palatable. There is a preference for candy bars. I've decided to give up candy bars, at least the metaphorical ones, not just for Lent, but for the rest of my life. Psalm 32 reverberates in my brain and my heart and in my gut. The psalmist writes, happiness comes from having your rebellion taken away, from having your failure completely covered. Happiness comes from Yahweh not counting your mistakes, from having nothing to hide. This is why living into Living More with Less is a great way to spend Lent. To share what I mean when I speak of More with Less theology, I'm going to share with you a slightly expanded version of my contribution to the 30th anniversary edition of living more with less. It happened again. For the second time, I was minding my own business when 5 phrases appearing in print caught my attention. Do justice, learn from the world community, cherish the natural order, nurture people, and nonconform freely. It first happened in 2002 when I noticed these phrases on a poster in a Syracuse Cultural Workers Tools for Change catalog. Now I was perusing books on a giveaway table at the seminary where I was teaching. I saw the words again, this time in a book about simple family celebrations, so I snapped it up. A related moment happened when I walked into the weekly chapel service at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. This is where I was enrolled in graduate school to receive my PhD in theology. The worship leader was visiting from Yale Divinity School and had created an entire worship service with quotations and stories from Extending the Table, the sequel to More with Less. It was a strange experience, but it also felt natural to see a cookbook my mother had fed me from being used as a prayer book. Readers familiar with the 1980 version of Living More with Less will recognize these 5 phrases as the 5 life standards that Doris Jansen Longacre developed. These 5 life standards chart a path of Christian discipleship that's seriously and joyfully combining faith and action. Doris knew that being a Christian bathed in the waters of Anabaptism means living with what she called holy frustration. In the More with Less cookbook, which was published 4 years before Living More with Less, Longacre describes this emotion of holy frustration by summing up the main question many of her contemporaries were asking in the face of the food and fuel crises of the 1970s. At that point, Mennonite Central Committee had tasked their constituency with shrinking their food budgets by 10%. So More with Less cookbook was intended as a kind of guidebook to help people do this. We want to use less, constituents say. How do we begin? How do we maintain motivation in our affluent society? Holy frustration stands at the center of what we can think of as a More with Less theology created by the 5 life standards. A theology? What may strike some readers as a leap from the 5 life standards to a theology is really a small step. See, theology is the formal name we give to our talk about God. A More with Less theology, then, is the way we verbalize the connection we make between God's unified presence in the universe and our response to God as we live within the world. More with Less theology gives special attention to the ways that economic patterns and systems help or hurt our response to God and all that is around us. Our English word economic comes from the Greek roots oikos, meaning house, and nomos, meaning custom or law. Together, these roots form the word oikonomia, which refers to the customs and management of households, what we might think of as homemaking. In other words, doing justice, learning from the world community, nurturing people, cherishing the natural order, and non-conforming freely, well, these come together and become part of our household code as Christians. In this age of globalization, when our world is both a vibrant village marketplace and a groaning ecosystem, such a household code is more necessary than ever. This 5-part household code invites us to think about home in 2 ways. First, Earth as our planetary home, and second, the spiritual and physical homes we build as human beings. By understanding home as something that is ecological, spiritual, and physical, More with Less theology draws on the biblical tradition that speaks of the ways that human beings dwell with and in God. From theory to belief to form, God gives us homes, So how we make them matters. When I was in high school, a bumper sticker that my mother stuck on one of the thresholds of our house daily reminded me that world peace begins at home. This was the slogan on the bumper sticker. This was also my mother's way of reminding us that the Prince of Peace was ultimately in charge of household management at 19736 Riverview Drive, Goshen, Indiana. I'm grateful for the more with less memories I carry with me from that home. Smelling granola roasting in the oven, kneading food coloring into warm batches of homemade Play-Doh, setting personalized cloth napkins at everyone's place around the dinner table, and understanding that jars of homemade tomato sauce were not simply symbols of thrift. Cooking and seasoning homegrown tomatoes, turning them to sauce, filling quart and pint jars with the red liquid, processing them and listening to them pop as they cool on the countertop. These acts connected us to the productive cycles of life and offered satisfaction in the communal work that fed our household. These jars of sauce are not simple because they are quick and easy. They are simple because they're authentic. What you see is what you put into it. Love and hope for a world where everyone's needs are sustainably and joyfully met. Doris Jansen Longacre's words, and the words of those who join her in this tradition of Anabaptism, are theological. So Doris Jansen Longacre isn't just a home economist, but a theologian. Why? Why do I argue this, or why do I believe it so strongly? Well, because Longacre, trained in the art and science of household management, practiced her profession in a way that recalls the biblical imagery of the one who lives with us in our homes, dines at our tables, and in turn brings us to a table set simply with bread and a cup. While appearing in a fifth in this list of life standards, non-conform freely is the standard that for me ties all the other standards together. So I'll be weaving that standard into every theme and my teaching on each week, pairing it with one of the other four standards. And I'm beginning here with do justice. What does justice have to do with Lent? Well, along with living more with less, worship services in this series are working with a view of Lent informed by Leader magazine. And Leader urges us to come to Lent as the season of the church year when we focus particular attention on foundational questions of our existence. We're invited to ask, what does it mean for us to be the created and recreated images of God? How may we become authentically human? These questions are one way to think of Jesus' mission as a teacher, healer, friend, prophet, and shalom bringer. God comes into the world in Jesus to teach us how to become authentically human. This is a process we experience over and over and over again as we learn in new ways how interconnected our lives are with other human beings, as well as the vast number of creatures and life forms that are also at home on earth. This is why we heard the Staghorn Choral's testimony this morning. Longacre writes, to make due justice a standard is to live by both reason and compassion. As I read and interpret Psalm 32 through a more with less lens, I see that loving God's justice involves following Jesus with a critical mind and a discerning heart. More with less theology is for neurologists and immigration lawyers and marine biologists and high school math teachers and high schoolers whose parents make them come to church and research librarians and grocery store clerks and everybody in between. As more with less theologians, the fact of staghorn colonies rotting on the ocean floor is one that we're called to meet with reason and compassion. The fact of wealth disparity making it harder for people to live with healthy cortisol levels is one we're called to meet with reason and compassion. The fact of our own confusion about where we fit into our society as conscientious objectors to the culture wars is one way we're called to meet with or employ the ancient songs Jesus learned to sing as a boy. Even when the flood begins rising, they will never touch us. You are our hiding place. You, Yahweh, protect us from trouble and surround us with songs of freedom. This awareness helps us see the impact small acts and choices have on, and that those choices are important. They can also be both empowering and awkward, these small choices and these small acts. On the empowering side, I didn't fully appreciate my mother's preference for making pizza to getting takeout from Pizza Hut until I started to understand the science of whole grains when I got a job working at our local food co-op after college. On the awkward side, I'd have to coach my kids to not make derisive comments at the grocery store about people who fill up their carts with soda or purchase food loaded with what my husband calls high frickin' corn syrup. But along with this, contemplative spiritual practices have helped me stop believing the decision to live more with less is about being morally superior, because it's not. To get to this place, we have to do a lot of inner work to separate shame from guilt, because many of us were taught these are the same thing. If you don't save as much as you possibly can at the grocery store, you're lazy. If you shop at Walmart, you're disloyal to the cause of economic justice. You tell yourself you deserve the cruise to Alaska because you gave nearly 1,000 volunteer hours to the local nursery school, but you're not sure you actually believe you deserve the trip. You decide guilt is for the birds and refuse to let anyone try to guilt you into anything. I'm sure you can come up with your own versions of these statements. So, how do we separate shame from guilt? Brene Brown, the social worker and shame researcher, points us to an important distinction she and her colleagues make between shame and guilt. Brown explains, shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we're flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. Something we've experienced, done, or failed to do makes us unworthy of connection. Guilt, on the other hand, is adaptive and helpful. It's holding something we've done or failed to do up against our values and feeling some psychological discomfort. When we have the support to see shame and guilt clearly, we can affirm that living by a set of values that isn't reflected back to us by our society is tough. Defensiveness is a natural response when we feel under threat, whether by advertising that constantly bombards us or extended family members who make fun of our hippie habits, or friends who think we're going soft because we bought a brand new electric vehicle instead of waiting for a used one to become available. I'm especially good at that last one. Is that feeling of defensiveness coming from a place of shame or guilt? When we open ourselves to feeling genuine guilt, we're allowing ourselves to practice coping with discomfort. And let's face it, there's a lot to feel uncomfortable about in our time and place, just as there was in first century Palestine. Sometimes we try to deal with the discomfort by drawing stark distinctions between good and bad. We can lull ourselves into thinking that taking our entire family to a resort in Jamaica for Christmas should be a guilt-free holiday, while ignoring the structural violence of the high-end tourism industry. Or we can convince ourselves that taking a ballroom dancing class has no redeeming value whatsoever because it's a waste of time and money, and especially if we're spending time and money with people who are superficial. But in making that kind of judgment, we overlook how physically demanding and stress-reducing dancing can be. But making these stark decisions also masks how ambiguous doing justice can be. Biblical scholar Sharon Ringe points out that when Jesus is in the wilderness, the devil's challenges to Jesus aren't to do bad things, feeding the hungry, ruling the world with justice, serving God faithfully. What Jesus has to decide is when and how and why he wants to say yes to these things. This is also true for living more with less. A ballroom dance class that supports a family that has recently immigrated and includes people from around the world who are enrolled in your church's ESL classes sounds amazing. Or a Christmas trip to Jamaica through an ecotourism company that supports a cooperative of locally owned B&Bs would also be in alignment with your family's values and commitments to using your wealth to support alternative and small economies around the world. Doing justice demands much more than using cloth or more durable plastic bags instead of the flimsy carrier bags at the grocery store. Doing justice involves being willing to share the power we have with others. It involves risking separating shame from guilt and allowing ourselves to be convicted of missing the mark. But friends, guess what? Longacre explains that doing justice in the more with less way trusts that God is building a kingdom with people whose relationships are being redeemed and who are thus stronger together than any of them ever could be separately. I think this is good news. So let us do justice in the more with less way.